Ever wonder what happens if you spin mesh? Let's find out together. All right, so for today's video, what we're going to be doing is working with this copper mesh, which is about 14 gauge wire that's woven together, and we're working with 3-inch square blanks or 3-inch diameter circles. And spinning mesh is a bit of a more advanced technique, and there's certain hazards involved with it, and you'll see when I get into actually spinning it, but I want to just kind of go through a couple things about it. First is you really need to go through and silver solder all of the outside connections of the mesh, or else it's really just going to come apart on you. Wires can spin off of the lathe and it can really be hazardous. So that's really an essential part of it. While you're doing that, also make sure that all of the wire is annealed. I would recommend high temperature silver soldering those connections, because that silver solder tends to be a little bit stronger and slightly more flexible than lower temperature solder that you might use typically on plumbing or electronics. So I've gone ahead and made those blanks ahead of time and have them soldered and pickled, and you can check out our other videos about those processes. And what you'll end up with, depending on whether you start with a circular or square blank, is something along these lines, of course, depending on the size of the chuck and the size of the blank you're working with. And you can see that even with the circular blank, it's still going to end up slightly squared because of the square grid of the mesh. I think the edges are a bit unfinished, and I think that this could be an interesting component within a larger piece, but I wouldn't consider trying to do this for a completely standalone spun finished piece or anything like that. So those are some results. Something that you do need to really be careful of, because of the structure of the mesh is very different from sheet metal, is that there's a lot of stress placed on the wires at the base of the chuck, where you're spinning it down and securing it to the chuck. So you can see in these two examples where, as I was spinning, that the wires there at the base really took too much stress and broke through the spinning process. So that's something that you want to watch for as well. But again, I think it's a good component, has really interesting aesthetics that are different than anything typically that you'd see spun, and we'll take a look at how it goes to get them spun. So I'll do that now. Okay, so we've gotten the 3-inch diameter blank set up in the lathe. Remember that the outside edges, all those junction points have been soldered, and that's not exactly an easy process, but it's really essential to keep this whole piece together and not be any more hazardous than it needs to. I've centered it on the blank there on the chuck, and also pre-lubricated it. You'll notice through the spinning process that this is very different from sheet metal, because you're basically spinning lots of little wires, so it's going to be very bumpy and rough going, and I'm not going to push it too far or all the way down to the chuck, because again we could overly distress those wires at the bottom. If you did need to do additional forming, I would recommend taking it off the lathe several times to anneal to make sure you're not going to break those wires that are taking most of the stress. So here we go. So it does form very easy, but you need to have a very delicate hand, but you can see that there's a lot of friction and bumping between the wires and the tool. And the rim is not going to compress, or I would not try and compress the rim very much, because it's basically lots of little solder seams, and it's not going to be very flexible, and you're just going to get failures and cracks in those solder seams. So I'll finish kind of forming a basic acceptable shape. Obviously, if this was a component of another piece, I'd have some dimensions and measurements I'd be trying to set it to. That's probably as far as I feel like taking it just for this demonstration purposes. And you can see the spinning tool is going to burnish the copper wires. And also, even though it was a round blank, you can see that the square weave of the mesh is going to start pushing those corners out as well. So, but that's how spinning mesh goes. And we'll try with the square blank, which you'll notice even more pronounced corners on that. Okay, so we've got the square set up and centered and pre-lubricated. Just another reminder of soldering all the junction points of those wires at the edges. And we're ready to give this a spin. As always, I will set the bottom of the blank against the chuck to keep it from slipping or anything like that. And there's a fair amount of spinning on air because you're still pushing those protruding corners back as well. And that's probably about as far as I want to take that. So it is easier to push the material around, but a lot trickier to get that delicate feel to it because of that soldered edge and the weave of the copper wires and everything like that. But it does make for an interesting form, and I would consider putting this into a piece as a component as opposed to trying to figure out a way to just have a finished spun wire mesh part. But you have that one and the one from the little circular blank. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.